Many of the younger fans of the NBA are not aware of who Andrew Toney is, or more importantly, for this video was. You've probably heard Charles Barkley say recently, he said it before, but he said it again recently during this year's playoff run that the best player that he's ever, I think he said the toughest player he's ever had to guard was Kevin McHale, and that the best player he ever played with was Andrew Toney. And that's quite a statement considering that Charles Barkley has played with the likes of Julius Erving, Moses Malone, Kevin Johnson, Akeem Olajuwon, and Clyde Drexler. Now, let me say this before Red Pill Saver jumps on me about this. Keep in mind that when he played with Clyde Drexler and Akeem Olajuwon, they were on the downside of their careers. Julius Erving was on the downside of his career. Moses Malone's best days were starting to come behind him. So take that into perspective. But still, you have to say to yourself, who was Andrew Toney? And my answer to that is, you can make the argument, and it'll be an argument that would probably be seconded by many, that for a brief period of time, from about, I say 82 to about 84, the best shooting guard in the NBA was probably Andrew Toney. Now, you could say Sidney Moncrief. That'd be a good argument. Some would agree with that. But Andrew Toney, considering his role for that team, was probably the best two guard in the NBA. For the first 5 years of his career, he was a two-time All-Star. And he averaged 17.5 points and 4.4 assists per game. Now, these numbers might not jump at you like Kevin Durant averaging 30 or LeBron averaging 28, 9, and 7. I know they don't jump at you. But you got to also consider that he was the third option on his team, behind a Moses Malone who was putting up maybe 24 and 13 rebounds or 14 rebounds, and Julius Erving putting up 22 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals, 1 block. You know, Julius Erving was a stat stuffer, especially in his ABA days. So considering that Toney was the third option, for him to average almost 18 points a game, and he had various seasons where he averaged over 20 points a game, is remarkable. But more importantly with Andrew Toney was the fact that you could make the case he doesn't have the longest body of work like a Bird or a Michael or Kobe or even a Jerry West, as far as to say, well, okay, he played for such a long period of time. Because those who don't know, foot injuries derailed his career. He played 8 years in the NBA. Essentially 4 to 5 of them were injury-free. But then the last 3 or so years of his career, injuries derailed what could have been, what probably would have been, a Hall of Fame career. But before the injuries, you can make the case that Andrew Toney was on his way to becoming the greatest clutch player in NBA history. That's what earned him that nickname, that extraordinarily great moniker when you think about it. Although today's world, I don't know if it'll fly because of who the actual guy was, but that nickname, the Boston Strangler, was very apt for him because at that time, the Boston Celtics, along with the Philadelphia 76ers, were the preeminent franchises in the Eastern Conference. The Detroit Pistons had not quite yet emerged as a force. And the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan was still playing in college at this particular time, so, and Scottie in high school, so they weren't even a team yet, you know, to be reckoned with. But Andrew Toney would kill Boston whenever he played against them. He would destroy this team. He was the main reason, one of the main reasons, why, if I remember serving correctly, the Sixers were able to come back from, what was it, a 3-1 deficit against the Boston Celtics? Or, I might have it a little mixed up, but it was one year where they had to come back from a deficit. I know Boston came from a 3-1 deficit too, I think in 81 or something like that. But the Celtics had the advantage in the 82 conference finals, I remember correctly. And Game 7 was at Boston, I believe. And the Sixers had a history of being a great franchise, but faltering and coming up short in various moments. They had a 2-0 lead in the 77 finals against Portland, but blew it as Portland won 4 consecutive games. Blew it a 3-1 lead I think they had against Boston in 81. Blew the opportunity they had when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar went down in 80 in the finals. Magic started at center and scored 42 points, grabbed 15 rebounds, and dished out 7 assists. So here they were once again, facing a Game 7 at Boston, I believe. But here comes Andrew Toney, who goes out and has one of the great performances of all time. And it got to the point, 82, 83. That was the year the Sixers went 65-17. That was the year that they had one of the greatest teams of all time. When they would play the Sixers, Andrew Toney would destroy them, including one performance where he dropped a career-high 46 points against them. Like I said, this is a guy who was the third option generally. But they had no one to contain Andrew Toney. Andrew Toney was one of the great one-on-one players in NBA history. He did not play all that long, like I said, because of the foot injury that eventually ended his career by 1988. But the few years where he was truly healthy, this is one of the greatest one-on-one players, if not the greatest one-on-one player of all time. Now, of course, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, they had longer careers. But Andrew Toney truly struck fear in the hearts of his opponents. He's the main reasons why the Boston Celtics acquired Dennis Johnson in a means to try to slow down Andrew Toney. To put things into perspective, I'm going to give you some evidence, okay? Sidney Moncrief was a 2-time, if not mistaken, Defensive Player of the Year winner. Sidney Moncrief, hopefully, will finally be inducted into the Hall of Fame soon. He should have been a Hall of Famer years ago. Andrew Toney used to kill Sidney Moncrief. That's no knock on Moncrief. Toney was just that good. No one saw it coming. He came from southwestern Louisiana, which is now University of Louisiana. No one could have seen how great he would be. But in isolation, he was just murder. He had a very deceptively quick crossover move. He was one of the first players to utilize the fadeaway jumper to great effect. He had a cat-like first step. He was just a very good instinctive offensive player who double teams or even triple teams didn't faze him. He was that good. Danny Ainge once said in an interview, "I'll tell you, Andrew was giving you nightmares when you thought about playing against him. He was already the Boston Strangler, so by the time I got there, I had heard all the stories about Andrew Toney. I was given all types of advice on how to defend him. Be physical with him, just hang on to him, fight him, and hold him. I learned through my own experience that was the exact opposite way to defend Andrew. I thought it was better to just let him run wherever he wanted and try to let him get bored. Because every time he was challenged, either mentally or physically, he seemed to respond." One of the greatest gifts that Andrew Toney had It's something that you can't teach. It's something that you can't instill in other people. Maybe a little bit, but not to great degrees. A player either has it or he doesn't have it. In particular, in situations where your stress levels go up and players sometimes make mental mistakes. In clutch situations, there were very few players in NBA history that had the confidence that Andrew Toney had. The coach at the time of the Sixers, when they were great, Billy Cunningham said one time that, quote, "We're playing the Lakers. The game is in overtime, and we're down a point. We have the ball with close to 20 seconds left, so I call a timeout." The play was for Maurice. When he said Maurice, he's talking about Maurice Cheeks, the great point guard of the 80s for the Sixers, late 70s into the 80s for the Sixers. The play was for Maurice to hold the ball, and at a certain point, Andrew would come off a screen for a shot. Now, I know Andrew heard me, but as the play starts, Andrew runs over to Maurice and says, "Give me the ball," and takes it from him. I'm livid. Here we've designed a play, and he just takes the damn ball. So the clock is running down, and Andrew finally drives to the right of the lane. I'm not exaggerating, but 3 Lakers come flying at him to block the shot. Andrew lofts a 12-footer over them, banks it off the board, game over. His argument: "Coach, I hear what you're saying, but just give me the ball." That was Andrew Toney. Pat Riley, the Lakers coach at the time, of Showtime, said of Andrew Toney, "He's the greatest clutch player I've ever seen. To hell with Jerry West." Now, that might seem, as Stephen A. Smith would say, blasphemous and maybe even hyperbole, but keep in mind that Pat Riley played with Jerry West on those Lakers teams in the early 1970s. So he got to see for himself what Jerry West was capable of. Andrew Toney was one of the great clutch players and one-on-one players in the history of the NBA. But it's a shame that injuries robbed him of what would have been, in my opinion, and most people's opinion, a Hall of Fame caliber career. He started having stress fractures, I think, in 1986, and the doctors at the time of the Sixers couldn't detect the stress fractures. He had been essentially probably playing with these stress fractures for a couple of years, but by that time they were finally starting to cause him physical pain, and the doctors didn't detect it at the time. He got into it with the ownership and management of the Sixers organization. They thought he was lying. Got him to the point where the owner of the team demanded that Andrew Toney be drug tested, and ultimately his career was derailed, and ultimately he retired due to injuries. Understandably frustrated, angry, and bitter at the organization, but in particular at the Sixers owner, Harold Katz. And he vowed never to step foot in the Sixers arena until Katz was no longer part of the ownership. But it's a shame. It's a shame about his career because he kind of gets forgotten, you know what I mean? Because he played with Julius Erving, an all-time legend, Moses Malone, an all-time legend. He got all these guys in the 80s, Isaiah Thomas, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Joe Dumars, then some of the other legends, slightly more secondary, Adrian Dantley, Alex English, Rolando Blackman, Dominique Wilkins. You have all of these great, great players, but Andrew Toney gets forgotten. And Larry Bird once said of Andrew Toney in an interview years later, I think after he finished playing, of course, "Do I remember Andrew Toney? The Boston Strangler. Yeah, I remember him. I wish we would have had him. He was a killer. We called him the Boston Strangler because every time he got a hold of the ball, we knew he was going to score. He was the absolute best I've ever seen at shooting the ball at crucial times. We had nobody who could come close to stopping him. Nobody. This is from a guy who many people consider one of the greatest, if not the greatest, clutch players himself, bestowing that much praise on Andrew Toney. Andrew Toney played at a time, too, where the NBA, during his prime years, I say from 82 to 84, 85 or so, 82 to 85, Andrew Toney played, unfortunately, in an era where the NBA was just starting to catch on. He played in the early 80s when many games weren't even broadcast on national television, well, on even local TV, for that one. Sometimes the games weren't even broadcast on local affiliates, let alone national affiliates. And some of the games were aired on tape delay. The NBA was still transitioning from being a league that was struggling to now starting to be a league that, under the popularity of Dr. J and then Bird and Magic, was starting to really rise up and become extraordinarily popular. And with the new leadership of David Stern in the mid-'80s, they just went to unprecedented levels. Of course, Michael Jordan took it to a further level. But Andrew Toney gets lost in all of this. He doesn't have the exposure. We don't have the game footage. There's some game footage, of course, but we don't have all of the footage of all of the performances that he had, all of the great moves that he would do. I mean, like I said, this guy was a virtuoso with the basketball. Charles Barkley also talked about Andrew Toney's strength, despite the fact that he was a two-guard. He said in his autobiography, Charles Barkley, that Andrew Toney was the only guy, other than Moses Malone, that could post him up. And we're talking about Charles Barkley, a guy who was 6'5", probably at that time 280, because Chuck lost a little bit more weight later on after he became the man. Chuck's probably about 6'5", 280. Charles Barkley was extraordinarily strong. You could see some footage of Barkley where he fouled Patrick Ewing and knocked Patrick Ewing like silly on the floor. But he was saying that Andrew Toney, who was probably, what was Toney, 6'4", 210, 215? I forget how much Toney weighed. I think it was 6'4" and like 205 or something like that. But he was extraordinarily strong. And Andrew Toney, I guess in conclusion, I could just say he'll never be in the Hall of Fame because the body of work just isn't there. But those of us who have researched him, and damn sure everybody who's watched him, remember what a tremendous player he was. And that Andrew Toney was no baloney.